Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ben Ogles, Dean of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. We welcome you here to our annual Martin B. Hickman lecture. Tonight we have the privilege of hearing from Perry Hardin, a faculty member in the Department of Geography. Before we have a prayer and introduce Dr. Hardin, I want to say just a few words about Martin B. Hickman. I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I feel like I met him because he's such a legend in the college. And he was the dean. He helped pull together the college as it currently exists. And he was the dean for 17 years. The first dean and the founding dean, political scientist. A number of his family members are here over with us, several of his daughters and cousins and others, and they've managed to make it every year, and we really appreciate it. Thank you for coming. You'll see on the back of the program that he was pretty important for a number of things that still exist on campus. He helped start the American Heritage class and was a teacher in that class, besides helping to originate the ideas and to found it. He also was instrumental in starting the Women's Research Institute, which still gives grants today, each year from the Women's Studies program to faculty members doing work on women's issues. He helped found the Kennedy Center, which has all the international area studies programs in it. He was also instrumental in the Family Studies Center, which also, again, still exists and provides funding for family research. He was involved in a lot of things over 17 years, and those are some of just the major big ones. And so it's in addition to that, he was an excellent teacher and loved teaching, and was an excellent mentor for both students and faculty. And I've talked to a number of faculty who were here when he was the dean, and they talk about how he recruited them and how he helped them to succeed. So it's quite fitting that we would have an annual lecture and a scholar that carries the name of Martin B. Hickman to honor that record and to continue the record of excellence that we have in the college. Since the founding of the original lecture and the scholar, we have the endowment has grown, and we've had additional contributions to it, and we now name the 4 teaching awards that are given each year at the fall meetings of the college. They're also named after Martin B. Hickman. So we have those 4 teaching awards and then this scholar award and lecture in his honor. Again, very fitting tribute to Martin B. Hickman. So tonight we'll get to hear Perry Hardin, who strives to emulate that model. And first we'll have the invocation by Roman Huerta, and then Ryan Jensen, who's the chair of the Geography Department, will introduce Perry. Roman.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful that we could come here this evening, and we're grateful to be able to getting a great education here at BYU, and we're also so thankful that Dr. Hardin could come and present to us, and that we could learn more from him and the knowledge that he has, help him to convey all the points that he would like to, and to leave an impact on us. We're thankful for our families also, and we ask that they're safe, those that aren't here. And we ask that afterwards we can return home safely, and that we can do good in our classes and make good grades and study well and have the Spirit with us and all those things. And we're truly grateful to be here again. We say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Perry Hardin. Perry, I've known Perry since 1994, and he's been first a professor to me, then a mentor to me, And now I consider him a colleague, even though he's probably so much more of a mentor to me than anything else. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Hardin. Perry received his Bachelor's of Science in Geography from BYU in 1982. He then received his Master's of Science, again in Geography, from BYU in 1984. He went on to receive his PhD from the University of Utah in 1989. And shortly after graduating from the University of Utah, he came back and returned to the faculty here at Brigham Young University in the Department of Geography, and he began our GIS program. You think of all the graduates in GIS we've had over the years, all of those have been influenced by Perry and the GIS and remote sensing curriculum that he helped to develop. During his career, he's had almost 40 articles in great peer-reviewed journals, such as Photogrammetric Engineering and Remote Sensing, Geocarto International, Applied Geography, Professional Geographer, and I can go on, but he's really well published. He's had 5 peer-reviewed book chapters, and significantly, he's brought in over $2.6 million to fund both teaching and research initiatives since his hire here at BYU. I remember the first computers I used in GIS were computers that Perry had brought in on an Intergraph grant back in 1994. In 2007, Perry received the Presidential Citation Award from the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. That's one of their highest awards given to academics. And Perry received it for his service as the publications chair of the chair of the publications committee of the ASPRS, and also he served as the highlight editor there for many years. Perry recently began to head our geospatial intelligence emphasis, and he is currently refining that emphasis and its curriculum. He's almost done, in fact, with an additional master's right now from American Military University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Perry Hardin.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Dean Ogles. I count it a great honor to be here. As I spent a few minutes with the Dean and Ryan early, we talked about, well, how are you doing? And, oh, I'm fine. And I was doing fine, wasn't real nervous, until I opened up this folder and I looked at all the other outstanding scholars that have preceded me. And I suddenly got really nervous again. So I hope and I pray that I might discharge faithfully the trust that the Dean has placed in me this evening. A quick note about credits. Let me just, are we okay with that? Okay. A quick note about credits. Photo and direct quote credits will be given in the appendix of the presentation if you're interested. Also, rather than talk about dates, obviously this talk deals with a surprise attack. Rather than talk about dates, I'm going to indicate the amount of time between the event and the surprise attack, central to my message. Here's the format. If I have something like 16D, that means just 16 days before the attack, and obviously 6H would mean 6 hours. That may be helpful to you. Tonight, I want to share some thoughts about surprise attacks, or in other words, warning failures. I want to talk about some of the reasons why warning failures occur. The story around which I want to cast that discussion is the attack on Israel by both Egypt and Syria, which took place on October 6, 1973. I'll refer to the war as both the Yom Kippur War and the October War. The latter term is preferred by Arab historians. This is my question. That attack, did it represent a failure of Israeli intelligence? Was it a failure of leadership? Or was it something else? That attack took place in 1973, but we need to go back to 1967 for some context. The Israelis feared an attack by Egypt, Syria, and its other Arab neighbors. To spoil that attack, Israel decided to launch a preemptive strike against Egypt. After 6 days, the whole war was over. Now, the Arabs weren't just beaten, but they were humiliated. Egyptian mothers lost 18,000 of their brave sons in those 6 days. The cost to Egypt in war-making material was also astounding. Egypt lost 300 aircraft on the first day of the war alone. The Arab teeth were pulled, and it would take a long time for those teeth to grow back. And at the end of the war, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. Now, for the next few years, a war of attrition was fought between the Arabs, Palestinians, and Israelis. Much of the skirmishing took place along the Suez Canal itself. The Egyptians on the West Bank and the Israelis were a few hundred yards away on the east bank of that canal. On October 15th, 1970, Anwar Sadat became Egypt's president, the successor to Nasser. Sadat grew weary about the failure of diplomacy to regain the Sinai Peninsula. He lost patience. He ordered his generals in October of 1972 to create a plan whereby his army could cross the Suez Canal. Now, President Sadat was playing a long game. Knowing that he couldn't take the entire Sinai Peninsula from Israel by force, he chose an alternative strategy. That included a recapture of the Suez Canal itself and a limited incursion into the occupied territory. Sadat believed that the United States would then intervene to end the crisis. Washington would force Israel to return the peninsula to Egypt, at least that, to avoid future conflict or some escalated conflict. Subsequently, on October 6, 1973, the Egyptian military executed the operation. Crossing the canal, they rapidly breached Israel's defenses and overwhelmed the defenders. So complete was the surprise that it was hours after the crossing before the Israeli High Command finally comprehended that a full-scale offensive was in progress. With that summary, let's look at the warning intelligence process. First, let's ask ourselves, what do we need to know to blunt a surprise attack? It isn't so hard to figure out. What information would you need to detect and foil an unwelcome surprise birthday party? In simple terms, it means this. First of all, you want to know who your adversary is. We would want to know then the type of attack that they're planning. We'd like to know when and where the attack will take place. We also want to know the strategic objective of the enemy. What do they intend to do to accomplish politically by the attack? Finally, we'd love to know their attack strategy, their tactical strategy. Knowing this, we might be able to defeat the attack long before it's launched. This is what we want to know, but how would an intelligence agency come to know these things? All of it includes hard detective work inside a much larger process. This is my initial stab at a model of the threat warning process. Now, rather than define each red block on the diagram, what I'd like to do is give you an example that you might find more interesting. Now, let's assume that there's an extremist right-wing group in France that's been threatening Muslims. They're pretty public about it, and they're usually vague propaganda. In that propaganda, they speak of nuking all of them if they don't stop immigrating and leave France. Well, what we've done here is we've identified an adversary, and we've determined the strategic goal, at least the fuzzy goal to stop Muslim immigration and perhaps unreasonably drive Muslims from France. Now, the ears of an intelligence officer, and I've had the opportunity to work with many of them, would perk up over the threat of nuking found in that propaganda. It just would seem out of place. It's much too specific. It raises the specter of a radiological device or a dirty bomb being used against a Muslim neighborhood in France. What we've just done is we've imagined the threat. It could be real or not. It could be clear and present, or it could be in the future. We just don't know. At this point, we explore possible indicators that the threat is developing. In our example, we would include indicators which we could collect with signals intelligence, human intelligence, and so on. One threat indicator might be a greatly increased number of hits on a website where dirty bomb construction is described. With these indicators spec'd out, we then create a collection program to lawfully monitor each one of them. In the case of the website I mentioned, the collection might involve some backtracking to determine who seems overly interested and not just curious about building a dirty bomb. As the monitoring continues, we convert data into a format readily usable by human beings and by computers. For example, if we intercept some emails in German, we might translate them into English and French. Now, cross-referencing in the master database means finding pieces of information in that database that may be related to one another in space, time, or in personality. For example, we may have a list of members in that extremist group, and in a lawful manner, we might determine whether any of them have access to radiological material at their workplace. Now, as time goes by, the information, the data that we collect continues to come in. An assessment of the threat can be periodically done. We decide whether the threat is present by seeing how many of the indicators are flashing red. Even if we determine that the threat isn't present, we still monitor the indicators regularly and redo that assessment. Finally, if it's warranted, we disseminate the information to political, military, or law enforcement leaders. Now let's go back to October 1973 and see how well Israelis' military intelligence figured out the who, what, when, where, and so forth of the Yom Kippur attack. Then let's see where they failed in the warning process I just outlined for you in the previous slide. Now, Sadat's generals delivered the basic plan to him, the basic attack plan to him, about 264 days before the attack. As I mentioned before, it called for an assault along the Suez by Egyptian forces simultaneously with a Syrian attack on the Golan Heights. About 3 months later, Israeli military intelligence received its first piece of hard information. The source was a spy very close to President Sadat. He told of Egypt's intention to attack, and he provided the correct attack date of October 6th, 1973. What I thought about doing is going through these, and when you think you'd be convinced there was a surprise attack going down, raise your hand. Now, I'm not going to do that, but think about when you would be convinced. Convinced yet? About the same time, the Egyptian army started to train more regularly. They also ratcheted up the harassment of the Israeli occupiers across the canal. In response, Israel mobilized their reserves. This mobilization was unnecessary because Egypt wasn't planning to attack. They were just harassing and training. Now, I'll refer to this unnecessary mobilization later by the term April mobilization. Turns out to be pretty important in the story. All this Egyptian army activity became the status quo to Israeli military intelligence. It was nothing new to them, nothing odd or dangerous. The Israelis, they became conditioned to the constant beating of, let's say, the Egyptian war drum. The same could be said for the Syrian front. There were lots of threats, lots of posturing, but nothing to really be concerned with. Now we're going to jump forward in time, 16 days before the attack, and move to the Golan Heights. Now, if you don't know where the Golan Heights are, they overlook the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. Again, about 2 weeks before the attack, Israeli photo interpreters, I think they started to squirm a bit. A recent reconnaissance mission revealed a significant proportion of Syria's army some distance from the heights, but definitely too close for comfort. It's now 10 days before the attack. On this day, King Hussein of Jordan personally warned Golda Meir, Israel's prime minister, that the Syrian buildup on the Golan Heights was in preparation for a coordinated assault with Egypt. However, Meir was left uncertain by the warning. Now, I don't think the uncertainty was a matter of trusting Hussein. I won't go into the reasons why. The problem was that Hussein himself wasn't completely sure about that information. 8 days. About a week before the attack, Anwar Sadat spoke openly of impending war with Israel. He ordered all leaves in the Egyptian military to be canceled. back to the Golan Heights. 5 days before the attack, things appeared more ominous. Syria had advanced all their tanks and so forth up to the United States disengagement line. Now, this was no small force. Photo interpreters counted 800 tanks and 108 artillery batteries ready for war. Now, there's more going on in Syria. Syrian air defense units were placed on alert, and Syrian reserves were mobilized. The next day, Israeli military intelligence hit a gold mine. It was an up-to-date Syrian battle plan for their attack, the attack that was now 4 days away. Back to the Suez. There were more indicator lights that should have been seen because they were blinking red. For example, 4 or 5 days before the attack, Israeli intelligence reported that dozens of crossing spots or launch ramps on the Egyptian side of the canal had been cleared. That is, they had been opened up toward the canal so that boats and bridging material could be moved to the water's edge. Another reconnaissance mission over the Suez Canal the next day revealed more of the same. 3 days before the attack, the Israeli commander on the Suez was alarmed and sent several urgent messages up the chain of command describing every visual detail of Egyptian preparations to cross the canal. He was looking at it, it was right in front of him. Now, these messages that he sent were not exactly ignored, but they weren't taken seriously either. 3 days before the attack, as well as 2 days before, Israel's military intelligence detected that Soviet civilian aircraft were being diverted to Damascus and Cairo to evacuate Soviet personnel. Other intelligence stated quite clearly that this evacuation was in response to an Arab attack on Israel. 1 day before the attack, the Israeli Navy reported that the Soviet naval ships in Egyptian ports were leaving the area at top speed. Putting it bluntly, the Soviets were getting the heck out of Dodge City. Mossad also held information related to the impending attack. At 4 a.m., 2 days before the attack, a man considered by Mossad to be their best spy gave his case officer in London the code word, which indicated fast approaching war. On October 6th, the day of the attack at 2:40 in the morning Israeli time, Mossad obtained more information from that spy, telling them that the attack time would be 6 o'clock in the evening. Of course, this information was quickly relayed from London to Israel. We can stop there. That's enough to really make my point. So, what information did Israel have about that October 6th attack? Well, they knew their adversaries. That was a no-brainer. They had information about a coordinated attack and even had some battle plans. They knew the date of the attack. However, the time they got was actually wrong. The attack started 4 hours earlier than their spy in London indicated. To make a long story short, it changed at the last minute. Now, it was obvious where the attacks were going to take place. After all, hundreds of tanks are pretty hard to miss. Now, Israel didn't really know what the Egyptian objective was. If they had been able to imagine the attack, the majority probably would have believed it was meant to regain the entire Sinai Peninsula and maybe Gaza by force. How much did they know tactically? Well, they had the Syrian battle plans, but the Egyptians did have tricks up their sleeve that Israel was going to be very unprepared for. So they had plenty of information. Where did they fail in this process? Well, they knew their adversaries. They knew that Egypt and Syria wanted land occupied by Israel returned to them. This is our first big problem. They failed to imagine the threat until it was too late. Have you ever heard that term? What we have is a failure of the imagination. Well, this is what we had now. In addition, their indicator set was old and incomplete. Said another way, they didn't realize that the observed actions, what they really meant. Of course, some of this was related to the fact that they couldn't imagine the threat in the first place. For example, if you believe the Syrians might not attack or will not attack, and yet you find their battle plans, you might think that those plans were planted by somebody to trick you. Okay, while Israeli intelligence had plenty of data, I don't know how they pre-processed it, so I can't judge this. Now, I don't think that Israeli military intelligence was using computers. They had files and Rolodexes, but they also, more importantly, had their memories. Basically, they didn't understand that much of what was happening was the same that preceded the 1967 war. It should have been to them déjà vu. At this point, the wheels pretty much fall off the cart. If we mess up earlier in the process, this assessment is going to be faulty. Simply stated, military intelligence believed that the risk of war with Syria and Egypt was extremely low. How could this have happened? Why could Israeli intelligence not imagine the threat? As you'll see, to a great extent, Israeli intelligence staff could only see the incoming data and even the most ominous indicators through the lens of their biases. They couldn't see the red lights blinking because they had their dark glasses on. This problem was so prevalent throughout Israeli intelligence and the military that the Israeli Commission assigning blame after the war called it the conception. So what was the conception? Now I'm going to explain it. However, I'm taking the liberty to expand the original 1973 definition to include some more points that we now know. First, military intelligence believed that Syria would never go to war with Egypt, without Egypt. Syria could only prevail if Israel's forces were split between two fronts. Syria would never go it alone. Secondly, military intelligence believed the Egyptians had insufficient political power to force an IDF withdrawal from the Sinai. They believed that the Americans, those that Sadat was counting on, would never give Egypt that much help. Thus, a ground war was going to be Egypt's only option. Israel was also blinded by rank prejudice. They believed that Egyptian officers were incompetent cowards, and the Egyptian soldier inferior to Israeli soldiers in every way. Why? Well, because they're Egyptians. Also, given their superior intelligence, Israel believed that the Egyptians could never mount a successful surprise attack against them. Israel was confident that any attack would be detected at least 6 days in advance. Now, in the Middle East, air superiority is considered mandatory for any belligerent wanting to win a fight. The Israelis believed that Egypt could never defeat their air force. Now, besides planes, lots of tanks, trucks, and other things are necessary to fight a desert war. Now, because of this, you'll remember Egypt took a beating in the previous war. The Israelis believed that Egypt wouldn't wage a war until all that aircraft and other material destroyed in 1967 was replaced. The Israelis calculated that it would be 1975 at the least. Now, the sum of all this conception, it can be stated simply. Number one, it would be suicidal for Egypt to launch an attack on Israel. Number two, they would never start a war that they knew that they would lose. Now, there's one more thing that you ought to know. Israel believed that the Egyptians saw things the same way. Now, this is called mirror imaging. Let me say that again. Israeli intelligence thought that Egypt shared the same viewpoint or lived according to the same conception. I also need to mention the Israeli viewpoint of their Egyptian leader. Israel's military establishment considered Sadat impotent, a coward, a buffoon. He was certainly no Nasser. Now Nasser, there was a leader that Israel could respect and fear, but this Sadat, no, not up to that caliber. Here's a summary of the conception. So how might this conception blind intelligence officers to the objective truth, if there is such a thing? I'm going to exaggerate a bit here to make a point of how that might go down. Remember, a few days before the attack, Israeli military intelligence detected Soviet aircraft and ships evacuating Soviets and getting out of the line of fire. Picture some analyst, or listen to some analyst saying in his or her mind, it looks like Sadat is kicking out the Russians. Well, that clinches it. There is really no chance of war now. I mean, the Egyptians can't even put their pants on without Russian help. How are they going to use all those advanced weapons they've got? Well, Sadat, he is stupid, but he's not going to start a war until those Russians come back. Here are the parts of the conception that were accessed mentally by that fictitious analyst. Obviously, they're in orange. So it's time to turn our attention to the elite Israeli leaders and the warning failure. Now, I put this little graphic together in preparation for the talk, and it needs some work. It's a rough flow chart of how an elite leader might deal with warning intelligence. With some dismay, intelligence analysts have long noted that political and elite military leaders will frequently not act on warning intelligence which is given to them. How is this possible? Well, there are many factors. I only have time to share two with you. I will share some more when we talk about Israel specifically. Trust in the messenger. This impacts several aspects of how leaders accept intelligence. Perhaps the most obvious are the two I've got noted there. Different leaders view the intelligence community through different eyes. An organization which enjoys a reputation for top-tier work is listened to much more than a self-serving organization that has a history of mistakes. In some of those cases, leaders prefer to be their own intelligence analysts. Or, like Henry Kissinger, they may believe that they know more than the intelligence analysts do. This is off topic. I was looking at some intelligence material related to the 1973 war that was in a presidential library. And I found a document, and I turned it over, and it was an assessment that Israel was going to get attacked by the Egyptians and Syrians, pretty clearly. Well, on the back, I looked at it, and somebody had written, decades ago, I bet Henry Kissinger wishes he had read this. I'm going to find that again, and I'm going to put it in a frame. Now, this is a picture of Harry S. Truman giving a medal to Sidney S. Sewers, the first CIA director. During the Truman administration, the CIA gave up. They abandoned long-range strategic intelligence. They decided to focus on giving news, daily news with the secrets attached to it to the president. Anyway, because they abandoned this kind of analysis, they failed to anticipate some big things. They missed the Soviet test of an atomic device, and they missed North Korea's invasion of the South Korea. Now, these failures, as you might expect, seriously undermined any trust that the president had in that organization thereafter. Trusting the messenger. Now, elite leaders also have beliefs, perceptions, and values which impact their willingness to accept warnings. Now, the importance of these perceptions can't be overstated. One researcher, McCormick, would argue this, quote, not only are perceptions the foundation upon which decisions are based, but it is also evident that the accuracy of these perceptions is not especially significant for the process. It is images of reality, rather than reality itself, that matters, end of quote. The problem of leader mindsets is worsened when the leader seeks cognitive closure, a common mental malady that afflicts elite leaders who have strong personalities and strong opinions and who don't like fools messing with their grand plans. I'm going to speak generally about cognitive closure. I'll leave the details to the dean. The need for cognitive closure tends to block a leader from accepting new intelligence after an initial verdict has been reached. This obviously biases the judgment process in situations where the threat picture would become clearer through time. Obviously, there's significant risk here. When new evidence is presented, the leader would be unwilling to accept that information, any information that would disconfirm the decision already made. Joseph Stalin is a classic case of an elite leader who suffered from this. Even as clear evidence of Nazi attacks on the Soviet Union came into his intelligence headquarters, he still refused to believe that Hitler would attack him without first declaring war. Now, with this background, let's look at the Israeli elite leaders in the Yom Kippur disaster. I'll introduce them to you. Now, there are others I could talk about, but these four will make my point. This is Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel. She had the authority to order a total mobilization of Israeli reserves, such as would be needed in a two-front war. Moshe Dayan was the Minister of Defense. Of all of Israel's military heroes, he was Israel's military superhero. Major General Eli Zahra was the director of Israel's military intelligence, frequently briefed Golda Meir, Dayan, and other members of the cabinet. Another common briefer was Lieutenant General David Eleazar. As chief of staff, he was the commander of Israel's defense forces, immediately subordinate to Dayan. Let's first talk about him. Here are the highlights of his timeline. When things in the timeline are green, that's good. When things are orange, that's bad. When things are white, it means I haven't decided whether they're good or bad. Okay, here are the highlights of his timeline. Long before the attack, he seemed to be on course. He was right about an attack coming late in 1973, and he was also right about his belief that Sadat might take military action to actually force a political solution. However, as the attack grew closer, he didn't recognize the threat for what it was until just 10 hours before the battle began. Now, this is very unfortunate. Remember, he commanded the Israeli forces. Israel's battle plan required at least 48 hours of notice for an effective mobilization. As far as the evidence shows, Eleazar did subscribe to at least some facets of the conception. Here they are. Now, Zahra became the director of military intelligence about a year before the attack. Throughout that year, Zahra argued that, well, Sadat had neither the stomach nor the planes for a war against Israel. He also believed that those Egyptian troops, all of them, were inferior to what Israel could put on the field. Now, I don't have time to talk about his timeline much more, at least not in this sense, but regarding his false beliefs, this appears to be the case, how it aligns with that conception. But there's more that we need to say about this man. Here is his timeline as we get closer to the war. Because they were becoming nervous, many of his subordinates and many officers in the field requested that more intelligence be collected, which would clarify the Egyptian and Syrian intentions further. He refused. Well, things got hotter along the front. 2 days before the attack, he again refused. 1 day before the attack, as the frontline commanders became even more concerned, he refused again to collect more intelligence. Not only did he refuse, but he prevented any intelligence from leaving his agency that showed that an attack was imminent. Wouldn't let it go beyond him. In a post-mortem analysis of his personality, psychologists argue that Zahra almost certainly possessed a high need for cognitive closure, which froze on the concept very early and made it impossible for him to entertain alternative reasons behind warlike Arab moves. Now, Zahra not only rationalized evidence contradicting the conception, but he even refused to collect data that might support an alternative hypothesis. Even when contrary evidence was overwhelming, he insisted that it remain within military intelligence. In fact, the evidence also indicates that Zahra deliberately misled decision makers so that they would not entertain any scenario except his personal favorite. He held the personal belief that he should provide leaders with a, quote, best assessment, unquote, rather than alternatives which might confuse them. Now, this is all very troubling. I hope it's troubling you. It's not too strong to say that Zahra's behavior immeasurably damaged Israel's ability to defend against the October attack. What about Israel's prime minister? The strong, powerful woman who frequently held cabinet meetings in her kitchen. Now, it doesn't appear that she was driven by the conception. Indeed, she was frequently more open-minded than those around her. She made some good decisions. As the October surprise attack grew closer, her instincts drew her closer to the truth. 10 days before the attack, she ordered the reinforcement of the Golan Heights. 3 days before the attack, she was so upset and so unsettled that she demanded that military intelligence provide hard information about the Egyptian capability to attack Israel, not just a guess about their intent. She continued to have doubts and expressed them regularly, even over the reassuring assessments provided by others. However, in the end, 10 hours before the attack, much too late, she could only bring herself to a partial mobilization of those reserves. Now, why did she not order a complete mobilization? And why did she not do it when she first had significant reservations about the assessments of her advisors? Do you remember the unnecessary April mobilization I spoke about? Fearing that Egyptian posturing meant an attack, she ordered mobilization of Israeli reserves. Now, this was no small decision. Israel's a very small country, has a very small standing army, and mobilizing reserves takes men and women away from their work and family. Each day that reserves are mobilized, Israel's economy suffers. Her decision removed $10 million from Israel's economy. And guys, that was in the day when $10 million represented a lot of money. Now, the public castigated her and her administration. It was a source of significant embarrassment. The record shows that this memory made her more cautious in October, too cautious. Now, furthermore, when she made that decision in April, she went against the advice of her military intelligence chief. Did she dare override him again, especially when he and his colleagues were all so sure of their assessment? Now, there were other aspects which she needed to consider. Let me share just two. First, she expressed concern that a premature action or mobilization might force a response from Syria or Egypt. Secondly, she didn't want to fire the first shot, or be seen to do so at least, lest she should lose the support of the United States, who warned her not to. Okay, let's talk about Moshe Dayan, her defense minister. Dayan remains an enigma to me. At times he thought for himself. Note his correct decisions in green. And unlike others, he argued that Syria might try a limited attack without the Egyptians. 4 months earlier, he ordered the Israeli army to prepare for a war he expected to occur in the late summer. Now, these weren't bad decisions or bad arguments, but we need to be even-handed here. Dayan strongly believed that Israel's second strike capability and other defensive preparations would be more than adequate in repelling any attack from Syria or Egypt. Now, this lessened his fear of an attack. Like Meir, he was no fool. He was also aware of the political costs of a preemptive strike, and with her, he supported the unnecessary April mobilization. As incoming information was received, he changed his assessment, and that's not a bad thing to do. However, he may have reverted to the conception when stating that an Egyptian attack would be strategically worthless to the Egyptians. So what generalizations can we make about the key leaders? Most of the military leaders were unable to accept the probability of a joint Egyptian attack, regardless of incoming intelligence, because their thought processes were clouded by the conception. Dayan's belief system and decision-making process was more complicated. And what do we make of the prime minister? Now, in hindsight, we can accuse her of failing to follow her instinct, but this isn't really fair. She accepted the threat, and she placed it in a reasonable political context, but she had no prophetic powers. In the last few days before the attack, she had great misgivings, but she had other reasons which she believed precluded a complete mobilization. She decided to defer to her advisors, and this proved to be a mistake. So what was the Yom Kippur surprise attack? An intelligence failure? A failure in leadership, or was it something else? I suggest that it was primarily a failure in the military intelligence apparatus. Although there was plenty of information in the intelligence pipeline, which is the first law of warning intelligence, that there's always sufficient data in the pipeline. Too many intelligence and military personnel were blinded by the conception. This includes those who briefed the Israeli cabinet. Do I let the 2 civilians off the hook? No. Dayan certainly had enough experience to judge the situation on his own, independent of his advisors. Now, he did this, but he came to the wrong conclusions. Meir was not blinded by the preconception, yet she ultimately made decisions based on domestic politics and foreign relations. One of those was fearing the public repercussions from repeating an embarrassing mistake. Another was the fear of losing the support of the United States. In hindsight, we can condemn both of them, but neither one of them had such hindsight. I blame Zahra the most. His mind was locked down, and nobody had a key. He believed it was acceptable to deceive his leaders by not sharing objective assessments with Meir and Dayan. These 2 cabinet members were missing information they could have used to make better decisions. I'm almost done now. Permit me to ask a rhetorical question. What would have happened if Meir had received more objective assessments? Would things maybe have turned out differently? Here's a comment about her character from an associate who knew her well. Meir was an exceptionally strong and decisive personality, being imperious, overbearing, and intolerant of opposition. Subtlety and ambiguity were alien to her character. Her confidence that in any debate she was in the right was without limits. And it was this burning conviction of always being right that made it so difficult to reason with her. Now, because of her strong will, she was a person not easily convinced by evidence contrary to her opinion. But would not that same strong personality have readily accepted evidence supporting her beliefs? Starting on at least September 24th, she began to wonder whether she might be right about Egypt and Syria while everybody else around her was wrong. Had she been given objective assessments, I believe it probable she would have accepted the clear and present threat posed by the Egyptians and Syrians. However, that's as far as I can go because I'm unsure about how she would have weighed the political considerations, those genuine and legitimate political considerations. Still, it's interesting to think about. I like Michael Handel's comment. It's appropriate here. Like war in practice, the real world of intelligence is rife with political friction and contradictions, an environment in which uncertainty is the only certain thing. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, so let's have Perry come back up here and maybe take a few questions before we leave.
No hard ones. Yes.
Was the fact that it was on Yom Kippur part of Golda Meir's fear of not told mobilizing? Did that come into her?
Yeah, of course, it was a religious holiday. You know, Chad, I don't think so. She was too strong-willed for that. What it did do in terms of helping the Egyptians is it made it harder for the Israelis to mobilize because they'd all be at their family's house, or they'd all be at the synagogue or whatever. So it would make it harder for them to mobilize effectively. Anyway, other questions? Yes?
So is that April mobilization, what caused that? Was that under intelligence failure or was that mobilization?
That's a good question. I believe it was well, you see, was it the wrong decision? Yeah, it was the wrong decision. Was it conservative? Yes. Was it made in the best interests of ultimately Israel's security? You'll remember that a great leader of Israel once said, when he was asked, when will Israel fight her last war? His response was, her last war will be the one she loses. The point is, Israel consistently felt themselves under this threat. And so it was reasonable for them to mobilize. Only after the fact did it prove to be a failure again of intelligence. Anyway, that's about the best I can do on that one. Questions? Other ones? Yes?
So you mentioned a lot about Zahra and a lot of his problematic personality traits. Do you know what things led to him being chosen as director of intelligence?
I actually asked that question today, and I don't know the answer to that. I asked myself, how could a guy get that far? There's even a story that a junior lieutenant, intelligence officer in the organization, put forward a report that predicted that in 4 or 5 days, Israel was going to be attacked by Syria and Egypt. The report was sent back to him, and his leader said, don't send me any more junk like this. 2 days later, this junior lieutenant who knew how to speak truth to power again forwarded a report with more of the same. He was relieved of duty. Anyway, that's what happens when you don't toe the line. I don't know the answer to that question. I find it interesting, an interesting question. I haven't shared with you all of the personality problems that he displayed. There are more of them. Anyway, other questions? Is that it?
Did he decide to be deceitful because he was overruled in the April build-up in part?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that. He sure did not tolerate, let me share with you though, Dean, he sure didn't tolerate dissent. In fact, after the unnecessary April mobilization, he actually went around and said that any officer in military intelligence who assisted in making this wrongful assessment should be relieved of duties. It's pretty strong. Anyway, it's the kind of man he was. Yes?
Can you give a quick sum up of how the war went after that?
The Egyptians gave Israel a bloody nose. They crossed the canal. They went about 8 or 10 miles. It's my recollection. Very effectively. In fact, it was so effective that the Egyptians, they expected thousands of casualties when they tried to cross the Suez, and they only had they expected like 10,000, 30,000. They only had 300 casualties, so it even surprised them. That's one reason why the Egyptians today still consider that war, they consider they won that war. They had, for at least those 2 days, humiliated Israel. October 6th is the Egyptian Armed Forces Day. The Egyptians have a city, and they commemorate October 6th, even though you and I would consider it a disaster for them. They commemorate it by naming the city the 6th of October city. What happened then is Egypt stopped their advance. Syria was struggling on the Golan Heights front. Syria demanded that Egypt move on, move forward, fight on. And Sadat and his generals hadn't made plans for that. But after a lot of pressure by the Syrian government, he finally did move forward with no plan. And at that point, the Israelis began to prevail considerably. Eventually, they were moved across back to the canal, pushed back to it. The Israelis crossed the canal and enveloped them in the rear and surrounded them. And at that time, Sadat sued for peace.